Alright, Gemma, convert element? Oh, just divide it by 10. What? Well, you didn't say how to convert it. Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, we've been testing all different sides of Monster Hunter Wilds since release, and a little bit before that too, and there are two pretty convoluted skills that both come together, specifically on the armor, for the technically finally unlocked monster of the game currently, and usually when a new skill comes from what is essentially the final boss of the base game, even if not the final boss of the story, that skill does tend to be quite strong in Monster Hunter games, and that goes doubly for flagship monster unique skills too. But it's especially interesting when it is two fully new skills, and they work in such strange ways. So today we're going to be talking about a pair of connected skills, Elemental Absorption and Convert Element. These skills have some shared mechanics between each other and some parts where they differ, so let's start by talking about where they actually align and where they are the same. Both of these skills are triggered by taking elemental damage from a monster. This could be a fireball, it could be a glob of spit, it could be a lightning shot from Raidao. Anything that counts as elemental damage from another source works for this. This means you can have it triggered by any small monsters that have elemental attacks. You can hit a Wilk attack with an element, and because the Wilk crystal counts as being created by a monster, it will also trigger this effect if you get hit by the ensuing explosion. But an interesting extra note about this activation condition is that it counts if you block attacks, if you guard with a shield on a weapon, as you still technically take elemental damage, just significantly reduced, and importantly it counts if you use certain inbuilt iframe or counter animations for weapons too, like sword counter on switch axe, or of course shoulder tackle on greatsword is similar because it's also similar to blocking. Even if you get the timed dodge correctly on a weapon like dual blades or bow with unique dodge attacks, you can trigger these skills if it is an elemental attack that you would avoid and otherwise it would have hit you without the iframes. It will then just activate the skill. With that said, most of the monsters in Monster Hunter Wilds right now have elemental attacks, the majority of them. Everything threatening, at least, has some kind of elemental attack, except for gore Magala, who despite having very dragon-colored effects, counts purely as raw damage. However, there are some interesting extra notes for this too. When you do activate this, both of these skills will last for a whole 2 minutes, but then they will go on cooldown for 90 seconds after it ends. This does pop up in game when the cooldown ends. It will tell you that the skill is able to be activated again. This means if you can keep it at quote-unquote full uptime, it would actually be active for just under 60% of your time spent in combat due to this cooldown. So that is a consideration too when considering how good the skill is. Another thing to think about is because it lasts for a whole 2 minutes after activating it, even if your target monster is not one that uses elemental attacks, there may well be another way for you to trigger these skills in a zone that's like nearby them, maybe the area next door, because 2 minutes is a really long buff timer in Monster Hunter, and you can manage a lot of damage in that duration if the skill is good enough. The other thing to consider then is the elemental damage increases from both of these skills are flat increases that are added at the end of your damage calculations. So even if you have element attack up as a skill, which does give you percent element increase, maybe you're using something like coalescence, which gives you percent element increase, these will not affect the flat element added by these two skills that we're focusing on today because they apply separately. That said, now let's get into the actual numbers, and we will start with Elemental Absorption because it is by far the simpler of the two. After activating Elemental Absorption, you will gain element attack that matches the element type that your weapon is by default. You will gain elemental resistance matching the damage taken as well. Let's say that you're using an ice weapon and you take fire damage from a monster. This will give you increased ice element on your weapon, but increased fire resistance. So it is essentially the best of both sides that could happen here. Offense for the element that you want to build around, but defense that matches whatever target just hit you. For actual numbers, Greatsword and Hunting Horn get 50 element at rank 1, 80 element at rank 2, and 100 at rank 3. This is a pretty chunky amount of element. Dual Blades and Bow, however, get 30 element at rank 1, 40 element at rank 2, and 50 element at rank 3, which is much less exciting. Then all of the other weapons that I haven't specifically named get 40 element at rank 1, 50 element at rank 2, and then 60 element at rank 3. Offensively speaking, as a result of these numbers, the only weapon I would even really consider taking ranks of Elemental Absorption specifically on is Hunting Horn. And that's because 100 element on Hunting Horn is a pretty reasonable chunk, and Hunting Horn is far more elementally buildable than something like Greatsword, the other weapon that also gets 100 from this. None of the other ones here provide enough elemental bonus to their weapon to be worth the fact that, again, at absolute most, this has less than 60% uptime on a hunt, which means it's more like 30 element for bow and dual blades on average over a longer period of time, even at rank 3 of the skill. As for the resistance increased, you get 4 resistance for rank 1, 6 resistance for rank 2, and 8 resistance for rank 3. 3. Again, the specific resistances matching whatever element damage actually triggered the skill to begin with. Overall, I think elemental absorption is pretty meh at best, and it definitely doesn't help that there aren't like decorations for you to use the skill either, so if you want this skill specifically, you are forced into some pretty mediocre armor choices to support it. Or you can always make the talisman for elemental absorption, which does cap out at only 1 rank of the skill. Absolutely abysmal for a talisman. That said, that's elemental absorption wrapped up in a pretty neat little bow, so now let's talk about the more complex side of things with convert element. Again, like elemental absorption, this is activated by taking damage from elements. It lasts for 2 minutes after activating, can be activated in all the same ways as the other skill, and then it has a 90-second forced cooldown time after it ends before you can activate it again. This skill specifically adds dragon element to your weapon, and then it has a secondary bonus effect which deals extra dragon damage after dealing enough elemental damage, which is a super vague description, and this one is definitely funky. The effect this is most comparable to is the extra non-elemental damage burst explosions with the flare skill, which we've also talked about in depth recently on this channel. Let's start then with the easy part, which is the dragon element increase. When the effect triggers when you activate convert element, all weapons gain the same amount of dragon element increase, 80 at rank 1, 120 at rank 2, and 180 at rank 3. And this is actually an extremely hefty amount of element increase. You'll notice it's way more that you get from elemental absorption, and the only, of course, kicker is that you have to be working around dragon element for that to matter. But the difference for something like bow and dual blades using this instead of elemental absorption is like 130 raw element, which is pretty crazy. And because the number is so big, honestly, it completely makes up for the whole 2-minute duration, 90-second cooldown problem. 60% uptime is less of a problem overall when the buff that it actually gives you is good enough, and this one is right on that edge from what we've talked about so far. That said, the secondary effect is a bit more interesting. Like flare, as you hit a monster, you'll build up some sort of hidden gauge that works like a status, and it counts the elemental damage that you've done to them specifically. The general comparison to this at best being blast status, where if you hit a monster enough, you deal enough elemental damage, count that as a buildup, an explosion will eventually happen that deals dragon damage. Flare's explosions, however, are limited by a bunch of factors, internal cooldowns, unable to apply buildup on wounded or scarred parts, all that kind of stuff, whereas convert element's dragon explosion is at least somewhat simpler. However, I should note seemingly that there are some attacks that just cannot apply the elemental buildup for this extra explosion, just like the explosion from the flare skill. For a direct comparison with hammer, watch upswing combo makes the burst happen easily, pretty consistently every 2 or 3 combos, and then you just use big bang for like minutes on end, and you could not make the burst happen ever at all. Even on the training dummy, which doesn't even build extra resistances. And from what I've heard from others, the list seems to be an identical match to the attacks that don't work with flare as well. So right now I'm going to be scrolling through all of the attacks that we currently know don't work with flare on the screen, because to my knowledge, these also are attacks that will not trigger the convert element dragon burst buildup either. This again does affect how good this skill is for some weapons over others, and it's important to keep in mind that in mind as we move forwards. However, the fact that unlike flare, half of the benefit of the skill is just a bunch of dragon element attack added to your build, it's still pretty good even regardless of the way that it works for the actual explosions. The speed then that this bonus explosion triggers with depends on the amount of elemental damage that you do and the weapon that you're using, the attacks that you use, as we just mentioned. Using a set that makes your elemental damage higher will make this happen more frequently, and using an element that matches your target's element weaknesses will make the pop happen more frequently too, because it will make the monster take larger amounts of element damage, which is exactly how this buildup works, and it will let you trigger the explosion quicker. That said, this makes this skill limited in what builds it is good for, but also makes it better within its niche. Status and pure raw attack weapons cannot trigger the explosion. They do not deal any element damage, and they do not get any benefit from the extra dragon element because it doesn't do anything to raw or status weapons, as it can only apply to a weapon that already has dragon element on it. If you use any other element type, meaning if you use fire, ice, thunder, or water, you still don't get the dragon element increase, of course, because you're not using dragon element, but you will get the dragon damage pops on monsters because they are based on general elemental damage applied to monsters, not specifically dragon element damage. So if you're using a water build, you can still get the explosion pops, but they will be a little bit weird still, because of the probably most unusual part of the skill, which is that the explosions from it have damage variance depending on the monster. At full 3 ranks, they hit the training dummy for 310 damage. I have seen them hit as low as 280 in the wild on some monsters that are like completely immune to dragon damage, but it hits anywhere from 300 to 310 to monsters on average. Given that it is an elemental effect, it stands to reason that this is interacting with elemental weaknesses on the monster and changing the damage that it takes from this explosion based on their resistances, or perhaps even the specific monster part that you hit when causing the explosion. So dragon weak monsters will take more damage from these explosions, and dragon resistant monsters will take less damage. But again, the lowest that I've seen it hit is 280, which is still a very solid amount for what is essentially a status proc effect. All that said then, unlike elemental absorption, I do think that convert element has actual value in elemental builds as a whole, with special value of course for dragon element specifically. The main issue is that right now with the current balance of endgame monsters and our current spread of weapons and skills, attack and affinity, raw focused builds are outdoing element focused builds in pretty much every circumstance against every monster. This means that when hunting at a high level, the best element build actually in reality is to make an attack and affinity build that just uses a weapon that happens to have the element that the monster is weak to, rather than properly focusing on boosting elements specifically. However, if you did want to go past that point, if you did want to go directly into element above all else, maybe you just really like element and that's why, convert element would be a top tier equipment skill compared to the others on offer for your actual armor skills. When doing large amounts of elemental damage, you can get 3 or 4 explosion pops during that 2-minute duration window, which is like 1,000 damage or more depending on the monster, and that's nothing to scoff at all. That is more than most environmental traps like a boulder or a falling rock would do to a monster. Even at the half damage or so of running the skill at rank 1 instead of rank 3, the explosions would happen frequently enough in an element focused build that they should be quite high value. Add on top of that, the skill also increases your dragon attack for any specifically dragon element focused builds, and it becomes a no-brainer to try and include in that type of setup. The only thing that I would mention for people trying this skill is to mess with it in the training room if you are putting it into a build before bringing it onto a hunt. Currently, most base weapons in wilds have such low element that even just putting on element attack up as a weapon skill and then activating full convert element, maybe even using coalescence as an armor skill too, will make you reach and even possibly put you above the element cap for your weapon. Element cap is a multiplier of your weapon's base element number, and if you go past the cap, the element turns orange and the number won't go higher even if you have skills that should mathematically make it go higher than that amount. So if you try this skill and see your element number go orange like this, it means you have too many ranks of it and should probably cut one of the ranks off of the top, or just rearrange some of your other elemental increases. However, that part of the discussion comes with a bit of a grain of salt, because these two skills are the only skills in the game, to my knowledge, that don't have a decoration associated with them. So the only armor pieces that you can use if you want them are the arkveld sets, and while you absolutely can make a talisman for either skill, it caps out at 1 rank of the skill, which is incredibly low value for a talisman. Overall, these sort of findings here, from all the testing and everything we've talked about, are that elemental absorption isn't great, but convert element is solid for pure element focused builds with a far greater impact for, of course, specifically dragon focused builds. There's a caveat, of course, that due to the skill not interacting with some weapon attacks, it is definitely better for some weapon types than it is for others. It can be hard to build around, it can be hard to justify when you would want to use the build specifically, because it's not like something you would bring to every monster, but the value is pretty high for element weapons regardless, and it can be triggered easily even without being directly hit by a monster thanks to guarding or iframe animations with some of the weapon types too. The only real main negative for this is the 90-second cooldown after the effect ends. If you could keep this active permanently like Counter-Strike instead, it would possibly even make element more meta by its own existence, but as it stands right now, it is just a nice extra bonus skill. It's full on flavor and it has its potential spots of use, but I'd say at least until more monsters are added with higher element weapons, and maybe even if they change elemental absorption and convert element to be available as decorations, then they might break out of their niche. But right now, niche is the best possible word to describe these two skills, with obvious differences between the two, one of them being better, but neither one being something I would just recommend flat out for everyone to use. That just about does it for today then, everyone. A breakdown and explanation of the elemental absorption and convert element arkveld skills, what they do, how they work, their sort of intricacies, and just a simple discussion about whether either of these skills is good and how you would use them if so. I hope you've all enjoyed this and hopefully it helped you out, and if you have any more information related to this skill or any other of the confusing vague skills and wilds, feel free to leave it down in the comments below to help out your fellow hunters. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.